Hey everyone. Welcome to Chapter 11. And Chapter 11 deals with the U.S. Congress. And in these next three chapters, we're going to be looking at the framework of the United States government and how we're set up through the three branches of government. So we'll start with the Congress. Then Chapter 12, we'll go look at the presidency. And in Chapter 13, we'll look at the courts, or what we call the judicial branch. Um, And in this chapter, I want to say also, please note chapter 11 so you see there's no chronology after chapter 5 regarding the chapters. I've moved them around purposely to suit my taste because the order that the author had placed them in, I felt was not the order that I wanted to teach them in. So I moved them around. So that's why you'll see they're out of order after chapter 5. But don't panic because this is right where we're supposed to be. Um, so uh, this chapter again, we're looking at the U.S. Congress, and the Congress is the oldest branch of government. It was the first branch of government of our country after the Revolutionary War. Even under the Articles of Confederation, it was the place where any issues were derived and dealt with. And it really came about as a body that had once been the governor's assembly or council for the king of England prior to the end of the Revolutionary War. So let's move on here. Get this to move on here. Um, so as I said, it is the first branch. It's where the laws are made in our country, which was why what makes it so important, because this is where our democracy really begins and ends, is with the legislative branch, because this is where uh, we have direct impact on those who are charged with, for the most part, making our lives better. Because if you ask most people, why do you know? Why is it that these people exist? Well, it's because we put them there to represent us at the highest level of government, uh, to take care of, provide a mechanism for us to succeed if we so choose or want to succeed. Everybody's different. People have just different aspirations, but the goal of Congress is to enact laws and policies that reflect what we the people are concerned about. Now, I will say to preface that it doesn't mean that your representatives, like if you know somebody who's crazy, who's going down the rabbit hole, or has supports sexist or racist ideology, let's say a community of people like that, doesn't mean that your representative is supposed to represent that, but they're supposed to be the person who, above all of that, realizes that their goal is to represent all the people and not just a separate or specialized group of people within their society, particularly if that group is really has ill intentions. So uh, they're supposed to rise above all that in order to represent the people in their areas. Um, there are processes by which this happens, and you'll see that later on in this presentation. But then again, this is where the people's voices are heard. This is what happens after, we become free of England, and people had no taste, as I said before, for a monarch. And the Congress was the place where we got things done. And the way you can see if Congress is working is if what the people needs are being addressed and met in some measure by the Congress. Doesn't mean we get everything we want, but you want a Congress that's looking out for the interest of the majority of the people. And if that's not happening, that means that there's a disconnect between us, the people, and the Congress. And that's where we never want to be. This is a picture of Joseph Rainey, who was the first black official elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, served 4 terms beginning in 1870, which is pretty amazing. This is again leading into the Jim Crow era, but after of course, the Civil War, and he was able to get 4 terms before they started throwing the black folks out of office again. This is one of the most telling. Because you look at this chart and it shows you who if they have where do people have most confidence in terms of in our infrastructure of the organization of this government. So as you can see, blue represents if they have a great deal of confidence, and the gold is if they have uh, uh, a quite a lot. And as you can see at the top, the military people have a great deal of confidence in the military, 43%, and then another 33% have quite a lot. So that's pretty high. But look at where Congress is at the very bottom. And the question is, so why is Congress at the very bottom? Well, there are reasons why Congress is at the very bottom. A lot of that's been reflected in where we are today and how we got to be where we are today. And the lack of confidence in Congress, is a reflection of the bipartisan nature in Congress. What has happened to Congress today? And we watched the video. In fact, for those of you in the online class, you got to watch it also online. But we watched it in class, in my live class, called Earmark Reform, and it shows just how much money is being thrown at our elected representatives to basically support legislation for wealthy corporations and businesses using lobbyists. And a lot of fact, as a matter of fact, one of the videos that you watch that you're doing your discussions on talks about the revolving door, which is basically those who go to work for Congress, and then when they leave Congress to go work for some rich corporation that's paying them 10 times the amount of money to then go back and talk and they'll pay money to their buddies who are still in Congress to get them to enact policies to serve the interests of corporations. Well, you might say that's a good thing. It helps build the economy. Well, that's true to some degree, but what happens when they are supporting corporations over the people? And the people are paying high taxes and paying high values for foods and goods and services that no longer allow for the general public to be able to afford to live comfortably. Well, that's because the people in Congress are enacting legislation that serves their interests or has the pockets of those who are in corporate America. And so we have to do our part to make sure that the people who sit in those seats in Congress are people who we want to see and are looking out for our interest. Sadly, for most congressional races, the turnout rate is between 20 and 25%. So most people don't even know who these people are. People are more focused on the presidential races typically, but I will tell you that the Congress is equally, if not perhaps more so important than the presidential race in some way, shape, and form, because Congress has a way to check the president, and Congress is where the laws are actually made and policies are made that take care of the people. Just some basic structural stuff that for those, you may already know this, but I'm going to hit it real quick. So in Congress, we have what's called a bicameral legislation, meaning there are two houses in the Congress. There's a House of Representatives and there's a Senate. Um, the Senate is, there are two senators for every state, so there's 100 senators, and the House of Representatives is based on population. That's why going back to the early chapter we looked at in the Constitution, we have the large state plan and the small state plan that were brought together as the Great Compromise. So that's why we have two houses, and they're both relatively equal in power. But I would say that in fact the Senate I would say, has slightly more power than the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is called the People's House for several reasons. One, because it is where you're like uh, every county practically in the nation has its own representative in the Senate. So it's a much more localized individual who's like San Diego has its own its own person, or Southern region of California has its own region, it has its own representative, and it's broken down by districts. So California has anywhere from like 54 districts or so. So there's a representative for every district in California. And then you have other states like, say, Montana, that may have two districts or whatever. So they're able to have two representatives in the House of Representatives. So it's based on proportion or the number of people in your state. And that's how they determine how many representatives you get in the House of Representatives. And the reason they call it the People's House is because, again, it's a much more localized person who has direct interest in the things that are going on in that specific area of the country. Then, they have what we call majority and minority districts, and so that means that sometimes you have a district that is majority, let's say Democrat, and a district that's maybe minority conservative, for example, or Republican. And then it could be the other way around as well. You may have a majority Republican district and where the minority are the Democrats or liberals. Some basic qualifications: you have to be at least 25 years old, 7 years U.S. citizen, and you have to have established residency in that state. You do not have to be born in that state, but you have to have residency in that state. The Senate, on the other hand, the senators, there's 2 senators per state, so this is what allows for equal equality across, no matter whether you have 100 people in your state or 100 million people in your state, there are always 2 senators per state. This is really important to know and understand. Um, there are they now the House of Representatives are 2 year terms, the Senate are 6 year terms, with no um, necessity of not being reelected. We have no laws in place at this point that has term limits. So it's been discussed multiple times, which is probably one of the problems in the Senate and in the Congress in general, is the fact that we don't have term limits for these individuals. But they say that the Senate is a safeguard against the tyranny of the masses. And this is really an important point because one thing about the Senate, it moves much, much slower than the House of Representatives. And in fact, that's probably the beauty of it. Whereas the House of Representatives is much more prone to public opinion and public outcry because it's more localized. So it tends to be very reactionary, whereas the Senate is a much slower bureaucracy, and it is the stabilizing factor that protects the country and our democratic institutions from any supposed craziness. But this only works if we, the people, are doing our part to make sure that the people who represent us are also doing their part and not doing crazy stuff. That's the other part that's really important to note. Qualifications for be a senator: you have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a U.S. citizen for 9 years and residency established in that state. Now, these rules were set up a long time ago. In fact, I just think they're kind of silly, to be honest with you. I don't think you should have to be 30 years old to be a senator. I think if you're qualified and you want to serve, that it should, if you're, legally, you could argue if you're 18 or over, you should be able to serve. But there certainly doesn't, the numbers should be subject to change and could, if we so chose, to make them different. There is a structure inside the Congress. It's driven by the party system, and there's 2 primary parties in our system, which are the Democrats, Republicans. Even though we are a multi-party system, those are the 2 dominant political parties in our political system. And basically, political parties are interest groups, which you'll learn about in another later chapter. But these are basically the 2 that drive us. And there's usually what we call a majority and a minority caucus. And this usually means that whichever political party is leading in terms of number in the House of Representatives or the Senate is considered the majority party, or as they say here, majority caucus. So let's say if the Democrats were the majority, had the majority of people in the Senate, then they would be considered the majority um, caucus in the Senate, and then the Republicans would be considered the minority caucus. Now, I want to point out that let's say the next election, if that changed and the Republicans were now, had more people, then the Republicans would be the majority caucus, and the Democrats would be the minority. So it can change based on who actually has the numbers. And the same applies in the House of Representatives. So it can go either way, and it changes constantly based on elections. It can change at the next election, for example. It may shift again. So it's a moving target. You see here in the House of Representatives leadership, there's a Speaker of the House, and then there's a majority and a minority leader. Again, based on who's the majority political party in that particular House, or in the House of Representatives at this time, and who's the minority. And again, it's constantly shifting. And then they have a minority and a majority whip, and the whips are basically like coaches. They're almost like they're the ones who kind of like they get the senators or or in this case representatives to kind of come out and make sure they're supporting the vote on particular issues, kind of rallying them to the cause. They're almost like cheerleaders, you could say too. So their goal is to whip these people into shape to get them to vote on issues or policies. And these are the people, they're called whips. The leadership inside the House of Representatives, of course, excuse me, in the Senate, there's the vice president who presides over the Senate, and the president pro tempore is below him or her. And then there's again a majority and minority caucus also in the Senate. there are four primary jobs or tasks within for each of these individuals inside uh, these uh, these elected bodies. One is first one, and primarily is to run for reelection. And that's a real money game and a problem for a lot because the senators, for example, the senators have 2 year terms. I mean, excuse me, four. Let me back up and say that the House Representatives have 2 year terms. That means every year they have to be trying to figure out how to get reelected over and over and over and over again. So they're always on the money trail and always on the money hunt to get people to fund them so they can still sit in that seat. The Senate, not so bad every 6 years, so you do have time to get stuff done before you have to worry about trying to go out and solicit money from usually from corporations and wealthy people who have their own interest at heart, not necessarily the interest of the public, the general public. Next is to serve their constituents, meaning us, the people. And then after that is working on legislation, the things that we, of course, the policies and laws that are supposed to be out there to protect or enhance our lives. And then also provide oversight over federal agencies is also one of their driving responsibilities. Okay. Um, when a process, when they are going before a law becomes a law, when it's in the process, it's called a bill. And bills are just that. It's just like preliminary prior to it becoming a law. If until the president actually signs it, it's always called a bill while it's in process. And so it's important to remember that. Um, and then so when because each member in Congress is also assigned to a committee. So there's if you're new coming into Congress and in the House or the Senate, usually you get the no name or dunderhead committee until you get some years in or get some experience or get hooked up with the right people. Normally you are pushed off to one of the smaller committees. But they have different types of committees. There are some that are permanent and some that are not permanent. So, like for example, the standing committees are permanent committees inside of Congress. These are committees that are always no matter what they are, they're permanent committees that reside in both houses of Congress. The select committees are committees that are based on if there's a particular issue or something that comes up that these are temporary committees that they'll create a committee or to deal with a particular issue, then they kind of go away. And then they have conference committees, and then they have joint committees. And joint committees basically are committees where, like, the House and the Senate may both work together on a particular bill. And so they cross over between both sides to try to expedite getting that bill through to make it a law. So there's lots of different ways that they can conduct the committee work. This just shows you some of the standing committees in Congress. And as you can see here, agriculture, budgets, all these are so. And then you see the ones that are in the Senate that are similar. And some of them are similar, some of them are slightly different or slightly different names. This gives you just an example of that. Okay. So the leadership inside of Congress is always within these committees, there's always a chair of the committee, and then there's members of the majority caucus and the minority caucus. So there's a structure in place, is what the point is here, that both political parties operate from. Each congressperson has an extensive staff. If you're from a smaller place like say South Dakota, where you got 5 people in the state, well maybe more than 5, but let's say you got 5 at least, your staff may be relatively small. If you're like California, a California senator or House or representative may have anywhere from 20 to 100 people on staff help them do the work that they are tasked with doing. So it's pretty extensive when you look at actually underneath the layer of that individual, the people who are responsible for actually doing the work. This particular chart shows you how bills are become a law and the process by which that happens. So as you can see in the Congress, it doesn't matter whether you're House or Senate, pretty much they follow the similar path. But the bills introduced by a member or members of that body, whether it's the House or the Senate, then it's assigned to a standing committee. The standing committee reviews it, and then it goes to a subcommittee based on what the issue is. The subcommittee reviews it, then it's kicked um, then after it goes to subcommittee, it goes through the process, and a report comes out from the committees that says this looks like it's viable or not viable. Then it's debated on the floor of the Senate, for example, and then the Senate votes on it. Um, on the House side, the different action is that they have a Rules Committee action, which basically means that they have to act on what comes out of once it comes out of committee, they look at the rules following that particular bill coming through to make sure that they've dotted all their I's and crossed their T's before it goes on to vote. Once it's voted on, there's a couple things that happen. There is a conference committee, but which is rarely ever used, if they need to convene both houses of Congress and decide, whether the bill needs to, if they're trying to expedite it or if they want to debate the importance or the necessity of the bill. Um, this happens with things that are very political, actually very politicized issues. And then it goes, last step is the president's action. So the president has a couple different choices. He or she, so far he, but hope maybe a she soon, can either veto it, meaning they're kicking it and say, nope, I'm not signing it. They can sign it into law, meaning that once they sign it, it becomes a law, right? So there's no longer a bill. And by the way, when they veto it, they can veto it and kick it back to Congress and say, nope, I'm not signing this. I want you to make a change. And they can reintroduce it or send it back again. There's processes for that. Or the president can do nothing, and then it becomes law in 10 days. So let's say at the end of any congressional session, the president can, if he does nothing to act on it, then whether he likes it or not, it automatically becomes a law in 10 days. Now, the pocket veto is another aspect that happens, that the president, at the end of any congressional session, and if a bill comes to the president in the last 10 days, within the last 10 days, he can simply put his hands in his pockets and do nothing, and it's vetoed, simply by virtue of it being the end of the congressional session. He doesn't have to do anything. It just bounces back, and then they have to reintroduce it in the next legislative session. Okay. So that took you through the process. This just shows you the examples. This is the last thing I would say. Who does Congress listen to? Um, you see the greenish color is when they say too little, and then the right amount is purplish kind of color. Uh, and so, or too much is the kind of violet color. But you can see people like the citizens are saying very clearly that Congress very, very rarely listens to the people. 71% of that top row, well, to people like you and I, say that Congress is listening too little. And that number is probably, this is a little bit dated chart now for probably 10 years, so it's probably higher than that now. But imagine that 70% of your people or more think that the Congress doesn't listen to the people enough. That means there's a disconnect between us, the people, and the Congress, and that's not supposed to happen. Okay. Things that Congress has oversight over, of course, they have oversight over, they delegate authority to various different agencies in the federal bureaucracy to see what they're doing or how they're conducting their business. Even though when the president nominates or Supreme Court justices or wants to approve treaties, it has to be the president can nominate, but the Senate has to consent. And these are the processes by which there are checks and balances in our system. Because you can see, like for treaty approval, 2/3 of the Senate has to approve the treaties that's coming through by the president. There is a process of impeachment or removal of federal judges and high executives. And you can see how that process is here. These are, when we say impeachment, we're saying there are charges against the federal official. You can be impeached without being removed, though. Just because you're impeached is almost like a slap on the hand. They can make decisions whether they're going to remove you as a byproduct of that, depending on the seriousness of the allegation. Okay. And that's it. So that's it for chapter 11. And I'll look forward to seeing you in chapter 12. Have a good one, you guys.